Pay me now, or I embarrass you!
The heavy leather ledger slammed onto the glass display case with a bone-chilling thud, the sound vibrating through Elena's fingertips and rattling the very marrow of her bones. The glass didn't shatter, but the fragility of the moment felt absolute. Elena instinctively pulled her hand back, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that drowned out the soft, festive carols playing over the department store speakers. "Do I have your attention now, Mrs. Thompson, or do I need to get louder?" Marcus Thorne leaned over the counter, his expensive business suit straining against his broad shoulders. He smelled of cold coffee and misplaced arrogance. To the passing shoppers in the luxury wing of the mall, he looked like a stern businessman closing a deal. To Elena, he was a vulture circling the last remains of her life. "Marcus, please," Elena whispered, her voice trembling as she glanced at the onlookers who were starting to slow their pace, curiosity piqued by the tension. "Not here, not in front of my daughter." Beside her, 7-year-old Lily clutched the hem of Elena's maroon dress. The little girl's knuckles were white, her large, intelligent eyes darting between her mother's pale face and the man looming over them. She was too young to understand the intricate mechanics of interest rates and defaulted loans, but she was old enough to recognize the scent of a predator. "Where then?" Marcus sneered, his voice rising just enough to ensure the surrounding crowd could hear. "In the tiny, cramped apartment you can't afford, or perhaps at the bus stop you'll be frequenting once I repossess that car your husband left behind, along with all his mounting failures." The words felt like physical blows. Elena felt the heat of humiliation rising up her neck, a deep, burning crimson that matched her dress. She was a woman who prided herself on her resilience, a woman who had spent months trying to bridge the gap between her late husband's debts and her own modest salary. But Thorne wasn't interested in her efforts. He was interested in the kill. "I told you the payment is coming," Elena said, her posture straightening despite the fear. She tried to project a strength she didn't feel, a shield for the child at her side. "I just need another week. The estate is empty, Elena. You're holding on to a ghost." Thorne reached out, his hand clamping firmly around her wrist. The contact was cold and possessive. "You're done playing house. If I don't see the full amount by sunset, I'm not just coming for the car. I've already made the call to Child Protective Services. A mother who can't provide a stable roof isn't a mother. She's a liability." The air left Elena's lungs. The threat was a jagged blade twisted into her heart. She looked down at Lily, whose expression shifted from fear to a strange, sharp focus. The pressure was mounting, the walls of the store closing in, and the world felt like it was tilting on its axis. Elena looked into the creditor's eyes and saw no mercy, only the cold calculation of a man who enjoyed the weight of his own thumb. She was alone, cornered in a palace of wealth she couldn't touch, while the man holding her wrist prepared to strip away the only thing she had left, her daughter. The pressure was absolute, and just as the first sob threatened to break from her throat, the grip on her wrist tightened, and the floor seemed to fall away. The threat against Child Protective Services hung in the air like a guillotine blade, the final, cruel weight that threatened to snap Elena's spirit. But before the first sob could escape her throat, the world shifted in a way she never expected. Before I tell you what happened next to Elena, don't forget to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into it. Lily, whose small hand had been trembling in Elena's grip just moments before, suddenly let out a sharp, guttural cry that sliced through the store's air. Her grip on Elena's dress vanished as her small body went limp, her knees buckling with a terrifying speed. She hit the floor with a heavy, hollow thud, her green velvet dress sprawling like a crushed flower across the cold marble. "Lily!" Elena screamed, her own knees hitting the floor beside her daughter. The creditor, startled by the sudden movement, was forced to release Elena's wrist as she lunged for the child. Lily's eyes rolled back, her small frame beginning to jerk with rhythmic, violent tremors. Her head lolled to the side, and a soft, low moan escaped her lips. To any onlooker, it was the terrifying onset of a seizure, a medical emergency triggered by the trauma of the moment. "Help! Someone help her!" Elena cried, her hands hovering over Lily, terrified to touch her, terrified not to. The mall, which had been a backdrop of indifferent luxury, transformed instantly. The crowd that had been voyeuristically watching a mother's humiliation now surged forward with a different energy, panic. People dropped their designer bags, gasping, their phones switching from recording a scandal to searching for emergency services. Marcus Thorne took a frantic step back, his domineering posture collapsing. The predator was suddenly a liability. He looked around at the accusing stares of the growing crowd. I didn't touch her," he stammered, his voice thin and reeking of cowardice. "She just fell. Everyone saw it. I was just talking to her mother." "You were assaulting her," a woman in the crowd shouted, pointing a finger at Thorne. "I saw you grab her. You caused this." Elena cradled Lily's head, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. But as she leaned down to whisper her daughter's name, she felt a subtle, rhythmic pressure on her palm. It was faint, hardly more than a ghost of a movement, but it was there. Lily was squeezing her hand in a specific Morse code-like pattern they had practiced for stranger danger drills, but used now for a far more desperate purpose. A tiny, momentary flutter of Lily's eyelid gave her away. The child wasn't dying, she was fighting. She was using the only weapon a 7-year-old had, her innocence, to create a shield for her mother. She was intentionally drawing the eyes of the world away from her mother's failure and toward the creditor's cruelty. Elena's breath hitched. She realized then the depth of her daughter's love. Lily was willing to play the victim, to lie in the dust and simulate a terrifying illness just to force the man with the ledger to back away. "Call an ambulance!" Elena shouted, playing her part, her voice thick with genuine tears for the burden her child was carrying. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes flashing with a new protective fire. "If anything happens to her because of you, Marcus, a debt will be the least of your worries." Thorne backed away further, nearly tripping over a display of silk scarves. He was the villain now, cast in the harsh light of the public eye, trapped by the brilliant, desperate performance of a little girl in a green velvet dress. The game had changed, but as the crowd pressed in, Elena knew this was only a temporary reprieve. They needed a miracle, and they needed it before Lily's strength gave out. The frantic energy of the department store, the gasps of the onlookers, the shrill ring of a distant security alarm, and Marcus Thorne's stuttered excuses suddenly died. It wasn't a gradual quiet, but a sharp, clinical excision of noise, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The heavy glass entrance doors swung open, and the atmosphere shifted from panicked chaos to a frigid, calculated stillness. Song Jae-woo stepped into the atrium. He was a silhouette of lethal elegance, dressed in a sharp black suit that seemed to absorb the store's bright vanity lights. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, a casual touch that only served to make his commanding posture more intimidating. Behind him, a phalanx of 6 bodyguards moved in perfect, rhythmic unison, a wall of black fabric and dark sunglasses that signaled the arrival of a man who didn't just walk through the world, but owned the ground beneath his feet.
Jae-woo didn't rush. His pace was steady, his polished shoes clicking against the marble with the precision of a ticking clock. As he approached the center of the store, the crowd parted like a dark sea. People who had been recording the scene on their phones lowered their devices, their bravado replaced by a primal instinct to stay out of his line of sight. His gaze was fixed, shielded by dark sunglasses that masked the intensity of his eyes, but the tilt of his head was unmistakable. He wasn't looking at the luxury displays or the frightened manager hovering nearby. He was looking at the woman on the floor. Elena felt the shift before she saw him. A familiar chill raced down her spine, a mixture of old fear and a forbidden sense of relief. She stayed on her knees, her hands still trembling over Lily's prone form. She knew that stride. She knew the way the very oxygen in a room seemed to bow to him. Jae-woo stopped 5 feet from the scene. The bodyguards fanned out instantly, creating a human perimeter that cut off Marcus Thorne's escape route. The Creditor, who had been so bold moments ago, now looked like a trapped animal. He tried to straighten his tie, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. This is a private matter," Thorne squeaked, his voice cracking. "I'm with the credit union. We have a legal right to—" One of the bodyguards shifted a fraction of an inch, and Thorne's words died in his throat. Jae-woo slowly reached up, sliding his sunglasses down the bridge of his nose. His eyes were dark, piercing, and devoid of heat. He looked down at the scene, at the ledger on the floor, at the bruises blooming on Elena's wrist, and finally at the little girl in the green velvet dress. The neck tattoo that peeked above his collar, a jagged design of ink and history, seemed to pulse as he took a slow, deliberate breath. He didn't speak to the Creditor. He didn't acknowledge the manager. He simply looked at Elena, his expression a mask of serious, intense focus. "Elena," he said. His voice was a low, melodic rumble that carried further than any shout. It was the first time she had heard her name spoken with such terrifying authority in years. He took one more step forward, his shadow falling over her and Lily, shielding them from the harsh fluorescent lights and the prying eyes of the world. The king of the underground had arrived, and as he loomed over them, Elena realized the game hadn't just changed, it was over. Song Jae-woo didn't look at Marcus Thorne. He looked through him, as if the man were nothing more than a smudge on the pristine marble. The silence in the atrium was so thick it felt physical, a heavy curtain that muffled the world outside the circle of Jae-woo's men.
"A private matter," Jae-woo finally spoke, his voice silk over gravel. He tilted his head toward the ledger lying on the floor. "I find that difficult to believe, Mr. Thorne, considering you were standing in my lobby, harassing my guests and assaulting a woman who was under my personal protection." Thorne's throat worked visibly as he swallowed, his eyes darting toward the exit, only to find it blocked by a wall of black suits. "Your lobby? This is the Grand Imperial Wing. It's owned by the Han Song Group," Jae-woo interrupted, his tone bored, "which I acquired in its entirety at 6 o'clock this morning, along with the debt portfolio of the Phoenix Credit Union, your employer." The color drained from Thorne's face, leaving him a ghastly, translucent gray. He looked down at the ledger, the weapon he had used to terrorize Elena, and suddenly it looked like a death warrant. You're Sung Jae-woo," Thorne whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The legends of the man standing before him were whispered in boardrooms and back alleys alike, the Iron King who dismantled empires with a phone call and buried enemies without leaving a trace. Jae-woo stepped closer, the air around him crackling with a cold, predatory energy. He reached out and picked up the ledger from the floor, flipping through the pages with a slow, rhythmic snap of the paper. "I see a lot of interest here, Marcus, a lot of penalties added to Mrs. Thompson's account. It seems you've been very creative with your accounting." "It's just business," Thorne stammered, his hands shaking so violently he had to shove them into his pockets. I was just following protocol." "My protocol is different," Jae-woo said, his eyes narrowing. He handed the ledger to one of his bodyguards without looking back. Effective immediately, Phoenix Credit Union is being liquidated. Your employment is terminated for gross misconduct and physical battery. But that is the easy part of your afternoon. Jae-woo leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Thorne and Elena could hear. I don't like people who touch what belongs to me. By the time you reach the parking lot, your bank accounts will be frozen. By tomorrow, your license to practice finance will be a memory. You will never hold a position of power over another human being as long as you breathe. That is my promise. Thorne opened his mouth to protest, but a single sharp look from Jae-woo silenced him. The king turned his back on the man, a gesture of total dismissal that stung worse than a slap. Get him out of my sight.
2 bodyguards stepped forward, gripping Thorne by the elbows and lifting him off his feet. He didn't fight. He didn't even speak. He was led away like a ghost, leaving the atrium in a stunned, breathless hush. The predator had been erased in less than 3 minutes. Jae-woo turned back to Elena, his intense expression softening by a fraction of a degree. He offered a hand that could crush bone, but was now extended with a strange, dark grace. The game wasn't just over. The board had been burned to ashes. The heavy silence that followed the creditor's removal was broken only by the soft, rhythmic click of Jae-woo's shoes as he closed the final distance between them. He didn't reach for Elena first. Instead, he dropped into a graceful crouch, his expensive suit trousers tensioning as he brought himself down to Lily's level. Elena held her breath, her heart still hammering against her ribs. Lily had stopped shaking, her small body now perfectly still, though she remained sprawled on the marble in her green velvet dress. The crowd watched, mesmerized, as the most dangerous man in the city leaned over a child with the focused intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond. Jae-woo reached out, his long fingers hovering just inches from Lily's forehead. He didn't touch her, respecting the space of her performance, but his presence was an undeniable weight. The tremors were a fine touch. His voice was a low, private vibration that seemed to exist only for the 3 of them. The way you held your breath to turn your face that specific shade of pale, very convincing. Lily's eyelashes flickered. She remained still, but the corner of her mouth twitched with the tiniest, most forbidden spark of a smile. Jae-woo leaned in closer, his dark eyes shimmering with a rare, dangerous glint of amusement. You forgot one thing, little one. A true seizure doesn't allow for Morse code squeezes on a mother's palm. You were communicating when you should have been losing control. Lily's eyes snapped open, bright and defiant. She sat up slowly, smoothing the lace detailing on her dress with a dignity that far exceeded her 7 years. She looked at the man with the neck tattoo, not with the terror the rest of the world felt, but with the curiosity of a fellow strategist. It worked, Lily whispered, her voice small but steady. He let go with my mommy. It did, Jae-woo agreed, his expression turning serious once more. He reached out then, gently tucking a stray curl of dark hair behind her ear. His touch was surprisingly light, devoid of the ruthlessness he had shown moments before. It was superb, a masterclass in diversion. But from now on, you won't need to play hurt to find safety. Do you understand? Lily nodded solemnly, her eyes locking onto his. In that moment, a silent pact was formed between the child who used her vulnerability as a weapon and the man who used his power as a shield. Jae-woo shifted his gaze upward, finally meeting Elena's eyes. The intensity there was overwhelming. He saw the exhaustion etched into her features, the lingering panic, and the fierce protective love she held for the girl beside her. He saw the woman who had tried to disappear from his world, only to be dragged back by the very cruelty he spent his life mastering.
She has your spirit, Elena, he murmured, his voice softening into something aching and familiar. And my timing. He stood up then, extending his hand again. This time he didn't wait for her to take it. He wrapped his fingers firmly around hers, his warmth grounding her, pulling her up from the cold floor and the wreckage of her pride. As Elena stood, supported by the man she had spent months running from, she realized that Jae-woo hadn't just seen Lily's act, he had seen through every wall Elena had built to keep him out. He had been watching all along, and the time for hiding was over. The transition from the cold marble floor to the world of Song Jae-woo was seamless, executed with the terrifying efficiency of a military extraction. Jae-woo didn't let go of Elena's hand. His grip was a tether, anchoring her as he led her and Lily through the department store. They did not walk out as the broken mother and child who had been cornered by a debt collector. They moved like royalty through a cleared path. The phalanx of bodyguards formed a moving corridor of black wool and steel, their presence pushing the crowd back into the shadows of the clothing racks. The shoppers, who moments ago had been filming Elena's misery, now lowered their eyes or stared in hushed awe. The air in the store, once suffocating with Marcus Thorne's threats, now felt electric, charged by the sheer gravity of the man walking at Elena's side. As they reached the grand entrance, a fleet of 3 identical black sedans was already idling at the curb, their engines a low, predatory hum that vibrated through the pavement. The lead driver, a man with a face like carved granite, snapped to attention the moment Jae-woo stepped onto the sidewalk. He held the rear door of the center vehicle open, his head bowed in a show of absolute deference. Jae-woo paused at the door, turning to look back at the store one last time. His expression remained a mask of serious, intense focus, but as he looked at Elena, there was a flicker of something almost proprietary in his gaze. He wasn't just taking them away from a scene of a crime, he was reclaiming what he felt the world had tried to steal from him.
"Inside," he said softly, his voice a gentle command. Lily scrambled into the plush, leather-scented interior first, her eyes wide as she took in the tinted windows and the refrigerated console. Elena followed, the soft seat a jarring contrast to the hard floor she had been kneeling on minutes prior. As Jae-woo slid in beside her, the door closed with a heavy, pressurized thud that seemed to seal out the rest of the world. Through the darkened grass, Elena watched the department store shrink away. She saw the store manager standing on the sidewalk, bowing repeatedly toward the departing motorcade. She saw the remnants of the crowd still gathered at the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the woman who had arrived as a victim and left as the guest of the king. Inside the car, the silence was total, broken only by the climate control's soft hiss. The pacing of the day had been a frantic, jagged nightmare, but here, in the belly of Jae-woo's world, the rhythm changed. It was smooth, silent, and incredibly fast. Elena looked down at her wrist, where the red marks from Thorne's grip were starting to darken. Before she could hide them, Jae-woo reached over, his large hand gently covering the injury. He didn't say anything, but the heat of his palm was a promise. As the sedan surged forward, weaving through traffic with a grace that felt like flying, Elena realized they weren't just leaving a store. They were leaving their old lives behind, crossing a threshold from which there was no return. The shadow protector was no longer a shadow. He was the engine of her new reality. The black sedan glided through the iron gates of a sprawling estate that felt less like a home and more like a sovereign nation. By the time they reached the main house, Lily had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep against the leather upholstery. Jae-woo carried the girl inside himself, his movements surprisingly tender, before leading Elena into the heart of the fortress, his private study. The room was an ocean of dark mahogany and old leather, smelling of expensive tobacco and rain. Large windows overlooked the city lights, but the interior was dim, lit only by the amber glow of a desk lamp. Jay-Woo moved to a sideboard, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass, but he didn't drink. He simply stood with his back to her, the tension in his shoulders visible even through the impeccably tailored wool of his suit. "You should have used the phone, Elena," his voice a low, dangerous vibration in the quiet room. "6 months. You lived in a basement in the city I rule, and you let a bottom feeder like Thorne put his hands on you because you were too proud to call me?" Elena sat on the edge of a velvet chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The opulence of the room felt like a cage. "I wasn't being proud, Jay-Woo. I was being careful. I didn't want Lily to grow up in the shadow of this." She gestured to the room, to the bodyguards she knew were stationed outside the door, to the invisible empire he commanded.
Jay-Woo turned, his eyes burning with a cold, repressed fire. "You ran because of the night at the shipyard. Don't lie to me." The memory hit Elena like a physical wave. 6 months ago, she had seen the side of Jay-Woo the world feared. She had walked into his office and seen him standing over a man who had betrayed the organization. There had been no shouting, just a terrifying, clinical silence as Jay-Woo had systematically dismantled the man's life. In that moment, she hadn't seen the man who brought her flowers or the man who played chess with her daughter. She had seen a monster. "I saw what you are," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw how easily you could switch off your humanity. I realized that if I stayed, Lily would start to think that violence was the only way to solve problems, that power was the only thing that mattered. I wanted her to have a normal life, Jay-Woo, a life where her safety didn't depend on how many men you had under arms." Jay-Woo set the glass down with a sharp clack on the mahogany desk. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just inches from her. The scent of him, sandalwood and steel, enveloped her. "And how did that normal life work out for you today, Elena?" His voice dropping to a whisper. "The world isn't normal, Elena. It's a meat grinder. You tried to protect her from me, but in doing so, you left her defenseless against the rest of them. You chose the safe world, and it tried to eat you alive." He reached out, his thumb grazing the dark bruise on her wrist. His touch was electric, a reminder of the man who had once been her world. "You thought my protection was a debt you couldn't afford to pay, but the debt of the past is settled. You aren't here because you owe me, Elena. You're here because I am the only one who knows exactly what it takes to keep you whole." Elena looked up at him, the weight of her hyper-independence finally crumbling. She had run from the monster to protect her daughter's innocence, only to realize that the world was full of smaller, crueler monsters who lacked Jay-Woo's code. The debt of the past wasn't money or loyalty. It was the realization that she couldn't fight the darkness alone. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the guest suite, illuminating a room that was more masterpiece than living space. Elena stood by the window, wrapped in a robe of silk so fine it felt like a second skin. On the mahogany vanity lay a collection of high-end skincare, several carats of diamonds in a velvet-lined tray, and a new smartphone, the do not call number already programmed into the favorites. It was a velvet cage, and the bars were made of gold.
A soft knock preceded a maid who moved with the silent efficiency of a ghost, placing a breakfast tray on the table. Smoked salmon, fresh fruit, and a pot of tea that cost more than Elena's previous monthly grocery budget. Elena watched the woman work, feeling a surge of misplaced guilt. She wanted to offer to help, to wash the dishes, to do anything that felt like the life she had built for herself. But here, labor was a foreign concept, and her only job was to exist under Jay-Woo's protection. "Lily is already in the solarium with the tutor," the maid murmured before bowing and exiting. Elena walked down the long, echoing hallways, her bare feet sinking into rugs that muffled every sound. She found Jae-woo in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with exotic orchids and the sharp, clean scent of damp earth. He was dressed in another impeccably tailored suit, his back to her as he spoke low into a phone in Korean. The authority in his voice was a physical weight, a reminder that the man who had tucked Lily's curl behind her ear was the same man who moved the pieces of the city's underworld. He ended the call and turned, his gaze sweeping over her. It wasn't the look of a boyfriend. It was the look of a collector who had finally recovered his most prized possession. "The silk suits you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But you look like you're waiting for the floor to give way again." "Because it's not my floor, Jae-woo," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Everything here, the diamonds, the cars, the men at the gate, it's all a display of what you can do. But what do I do? Who am I in this house?" Jae-woo stepped closer, the sunlight catching the dark ink of the tattoo on his neck. He reached out, his hand hovering near her waist before he pulled her flush against him. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped her, a familiar scent that now felt like a brand. "You are the woman who doesn't have to look over her shoulder," he whispered into her hair. "You are the woman whose daughter will never know the sound of a debt collector's voice. That is your role now." "And the price?" Elena asked, looking up into his dark, unreadable eyes. "The price is that I am the boss's woman. I belong to the man the city fears. If I walk out those gates, I'm a target. If I stay inside, I'm a ghost." Jae-woo's grip tightened, not out of malice, but with a fierce, possessive certainty. "The world outside is a storm, Elena. I am the only roof that doesn't leak. You can call it a cage if you like, but remember how it felt to be cold." He kissed her forehead, a gesture that was both protective and a claim. Elena closed her eyes, leaning into his warmth. She hated the cage, hated the way her independence had been traded for silk. But as she heard Lily's laughter echoing from the solarium, she realized the terrifying truth. She was starting to love the bars.
The afternoon sun stretched long, golden fingers across the mahogany floor of the library, casting the room in a warmth that felt almost medicinal. Elena stood in the threshold, her hand resting against the doorframe, watching a scene she hadn't dared to imagine in the lonely months of her flight. Jae-woo was sitting on the floor, the same floor that cost more than her husband's life insurance policy, with his suit jacket discarded and his white sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful, ink-etched muscles of his forearms. Between him and Lily sat a hand-carved jade go board, the black and white stones catching the light like small, polished eyes. "You see, Lily," Jae-woo said, his voice dropping into that low instructional hum that commanded absolute focus. "The enemy thinks the goal is to take his territory. He will rush the center, loud and aggressive, like the man in the store. But while he is looking at the center, you are quietly building your walls at the edges. You don't fight him where he is strong. You make it so that when he finally turns around, he has nowhere left to stand." Lily leaned forward, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. She picked up a white stone, her small finger steady. She didn't hesitate. She placed the stone at the far corner of the board, a quiet flanking move that mirrored the very wit she had used to save her mother only days before. Jae-woo's eyes flickered with a dark, proud light. "Superb. You've trapped my flank. Now I have to choose between saving my peace or losing the board. What do you think I will do?" "Your wait," Lily whispered, her eyes never leaving the game, "because you're the king, and kings don't panic." Jae-woo let out a short, rare bark of a laugh, the sound rich and genuine. He looked up then, sensing Elena's presence before he actually saw her. The intensity in his gaze didn't soften, but it shifted, turning from the cold calculation of a strategist to something fierce and protective. Elena felt a lump form in her throat, a physical manifestation of the armor she had worn for years finally beginning to crack. For so long she had been the only wall between Lily and the world. She had been the strategist, the shield, and the soldier, waking up every morning with the crushing weight of their survival resting solely on her shoulders. She had thought that love was a liability and that protection was a debt she couldn't afford. But as she watched Jae-woo guide Lily's hand, teaching her how to navigate a world that was often cruel, Elena realized that the monster she had feared was the only one capable of teaching her daughter how to survive the other monsters. For the first time, the weight didn't feel so heavy. She wasn't the only one fighting anymore. Jae-woo stood up with a fluid, predatory grace and walked toward her. He didn't say a word. He simply placed a hand on her waist and drew her into the room, bringing her into the circle of warmth and jade. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, watching Lily contemplate her next move. The debt was paid. The hunt was over. In the heart of the Iron King's fortress, Elena finally let go of the sword she had been holding for so long, realizing that being loved by a man the world feared was the only way to truly be free.